Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the broadcast this evening. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator. And may I start off by saying Happy New Year to you and Happy New Year to our viewers, our participants on this program. It's not too late to say Happy New Year. It's probably a bit stretched to say Merry Christmas, but I'm sure I can take liberties at that level. But I'm glad and I'm happy to be back here.
Thank you very much, sir. Happy New Year to you too, sir. Um, Sir, I'll just go straight into the questions today. And I can see some people are responding Happy New Year as well straight away on YouTube to you, sir. So thank you for that, sir. Um, Last year, when we ended the program just before Christmas, we were talking about the former South African president that passed away, de Klerk, and what he meant to that region of the world. But since that program, we've then had another major name in South Africa who has passed on in the person of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And I know you haven't had the opportunity to comment on that. What are your views about Archbishop Desmond Tutu, sir?
Well, one would say he was the last of the Titans. Um, a great figure in South Africa, in Africa, and in the world. Frankly, and this is going to sound controversial, I will rank him the highest of those three: Mandela, de Klerk, and Desmond Tutu. He was a very complex man, but a very brave man. He didn't go into exile despite the fact that he knew the dangers that he faced. He stood in front of demonstrating students, demonstrating youth, and he told the police he was the shield for those people. And if they were going to shoot at anybody, they should shoot at him. And he was dealing with a dangerous situation. He was facing an evil regime. You know, he could have gone into exile, like Thabo Mbeki and all the others. Well, from what I've learned now, he knew just some of the dangers that he faced. But I don't think he knew that the order to execute him actually was made. And here he was, returning from a trip. I think he was coming back from Lesotho, where he was bishop as well. And the official assassin had this gun sight trained on him. But the instruction was that the trigger must not be pulled until the last order was given. And so the hand was on the trigger, and that last order was not given. And so he actually walked past, what would have been his own Steve Biko day. He later on got to know. So he was a very, very brave man. He confronted evil. And and yet he didn't tolerate evil from black governments, whether in South Africa itself or in Africa, or from evil governments anywhere. To him, evil was evil. So with the world lost a great man. He deserved the Nobel Prize that he got. Uh, a lot of, well, some people within South Africa really didn't understand him completely. I'm not sure I even do, because his emphasis on reconciliation was very spiritual. Incidentally, I met him 3 or 4 times in London during our Nadeko days. And so I was able to ask him these questions. And he was talking about reconciliation with self, reconciliation with God, and reconciliation with fellow human beings. To me, as a political scientist, that was too complex for me to grasp. But he had to live this, concept of reconciliation on a daily basis within South Africa itself. And so some of the ANC people thought that as chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, he was too soft on the evil apparatchiks of the apartheid regime, that he let them off. He let them off to, as long as they confessed and said they were sorry, he let them off the hook, where he was leaving them up to themselves and their God. If you were lying, if you are not really sincere, it's only God who could tell. But people didn't understand it. But they showed that he was a bishop, a servant of God. And so his roles were multiple and were complex. But believe me, he was a great man that we lost. And he would forever belong in the pantheons of African greats that go back to Shaka Zulu, that goes back to some of the Ashanti kings, the Shona kings, the Alafins, the Oba of Benins. He will belong in that pantheon. Nkrumah, Sekou Touré. That's where you will find him.
Sir, do you see South Africa running into a leadership void, if you will, with all these great names going, regardless of the kind of way history would perceive them, right? De Klerk gone, Nelson Mandela gone, Desmond Tutu gone. Is this creating a void for South Africa?
No, I mean, after all, they will say we still have Thabo Mbeki, we still have Cyril Ramaphosa, the present president. No, each nation is confronted with, great leaders and not so great leaders. If you ask me to give you names of American greats or British greats, not all the presidents will come into that category, or prime ministers. In the case of Britain, even post World War II, and yet there will always be prime ministers in Britain, and there will always be presidents in America. So there will always be presidents in South Africa. I know your question was leaders rather than presidents, because there's a distinction between the two. You have leaders who never became president. I mean, Desmond Tutu was never a president.
Yes, sir.
So there will always be, you see, events and occasions create opportunities for leaders to come up. And you'll be amazed that when there is a crisis in the life of a nation, even people you've never heard of, that may be the opportunity to step into the void and come into the gap with for their people. So there will always be great who events and opportunities will provide for.
Thank you for that, sir. Now, there's another point I want to pick you up on, actually, Prof, because this is in relation to another death in Nigeria. Before I say that, though, congratulations on your new book, your ebook, that talks about a lot of all the questions that you've answered on this program, which we've now packaged into a book. So, congratulations on that. But
Thank you.
I had a news about another leader in Nigeria that passed on, who you had spoken about in your book, and I would read one or two things that you mentioned at the time. You said people tend to forget the background of that letter. A case had been taken to court challenging the legality and constitutionality of Ernest Shonekan, interim of the interim national government. A court of competent jurisdiction had declared that the interim national government was illegal, it was unconstitutional, and it had been called upon to vacate the office. Um, what is your view on that government and on the interim national leader Ernest Shonekan, who has also now passed away? What is your view on that, sir?
Well, I mean, my view has not changed because there were circumstances I did not create. I wasn't the one who went to court. I wasn't the judge who gave the judgment. Um, I was only reacting to the judgment of the court. It's a tragedy. Some of the some what has happened to Nigeria in the past. Some will even say that it's a tragedy what is happening now. And history will record how each one of us who had any role to play in the tragic history of this country, particularly the June 12th election that was then annulled, whether our role was small or big, whether our role filled the screen or we were just minor players. History will record what we did, and judgment will be passed on that role. However, we must bear in mind that human beings are not gods, even though when people are in office, they tend to forget that. And to the extent that we are not gods, mistakes will be made. Mistakes as we human beings judge them. But it is possible that the judgment of God may be different from the judgment of we human beings. Issues arose that allowed Chief Shonekan to play this controversial role. He played it to the best of his ability, and now he's passed on to meet his maker, as all of us will eventually meet our maker. And when that book of judgment is then opened, judgment will be passed on us, and that will be the correct final judgment. All our own views on what Chief Shonekan did or did not do will also be entered into the book of records, and we will be judged also on that. So let us be charitable about that. And there were good things he did in his life. History will also record that. I sympathize with his family, and I sympathize with Nigeria. That's another leader who has vacated the scene.
Thank you for that, sir. Someone just said on YouTube, your book is a great book. Everyone should get one. I missed some sessions, and it was refreshing reading through the questions and Prof's responses. So some people are finding that very useful.
Thank you.
Again, last year, sir, we were talking about Libya, and then we had that funny incident where we had to stop the broadcast. And this was the elections that were supposed to have taken place in Libya, and the fact that Gaddafi's son was going to be part of that. Now, Libya has been thrown into turmoil, even with the elections and where that goes for the future of that country. What is your take on what has happened in Libya? And then we'll go to Russia to talk about some questions about Russia, sir.
Well, I think it's as we expected. The elections had been postponed, and it doesn't matter how many times you postpone that elections. You cannot build events on voids. They have no constitution, and if they have no constitution, there's nothing the lawyers call the ground norm for the values of which the country will be run. There's no agreement, no consensus. Then on what do you want to, on what do you want to, why do you expect that there will be an understanding of the need for elections and what will govern that election? I mean, it is incredible what is going on. The tragedy in Libya, of course, we all know the roots. And even though the bombs have stopped falling from external forces, those external forces are still within Libya and priming various groups in Libya. The Libyans are not autochthonous. They are not, the Libyans are not acting independently. There are groups that are supported, if not created from abroad. And until those interventionists themselves reach agreement among themselves as to the kind of Libya that they want, Libya will continue to be in a state of turmoil. It reminds me of Lebanon. But let's not go that far. However, one of the things that baffle me is why the United Nations Secretary General will have an American as his special representative in Libya when the United States was one of the parties that destroyed Libya, that went after Gaddafi, that sponsored this assassination. I'm baffled by that decision because, when Dag Hammarskjöld, a name that will not resonate with probably anybody now, except people of my generation, Dag Hammarskjöld was, I believe, the first Secretary General of the United Nations, either the first or the second. That was the heyday of the United Nations. People were picked from nations that were neutral to the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So you had Indians, you had Swedes, you had Swiss, who were brought into the system. You had Nigerians, you had some Ghanaians who were brought into the system because people believe they were neutral. They will not that they will not be influenced by what was going on around them, but at least the people where they were going to knew these were United Nations people and not people representing their own countries. And now you want to tell me that there are no longer Swedes or Swiss or Norwegians or Nigerians or Indians or Australians, Canadians used to play big role within the pool of the personnel that you could call upon to represent the United Nations. And the people, they were, not that they didn't make mistakes, of course they were human beings, but there was this belief that they were neutral. You couldn't find any of them. You had to pick on an American to represent the United Nations in Libya. You're still chasing shadows. So I'm not surprised that that election was postponed and it's still going to be postponed. And if they do have it, it will have no legitimacy. Write that constitution first, no matter how long it is going to take. Write that constitution first. I mean, after all, when the United States was being formed, the first job of that Congress was to write the Constitution, in addition to the Declaration of Independence and everything. So people know what to show. All independent African countries started with constitutions. So it's not rocket science. And if you cannot have an agreement on constitution, what are you going for in having election? What?
Thank you for that. Someone's just said, before we leave Africa for Russia, there is a question they want you to address. And that is one to do with Nigeria lifting the ban on Twitter after 7 months of the lockdown. And I think we've talked on this program once about social media, its impact on government, and how governments should be dealing with these social media companies. What's your take on the news about Nigeria unbanning Twitter?
Well, the the legal situation presumably was that there was the tee-off between Nigeria and Twitter. But as one Nigerian put it to me, we Nigerians never left Twitter, and we found our way to get through it. However, let me say this. I even didn't know this until this issue arose. How can a company, and Twitter is a company, operate and trade in Nigeria as it does in several countries without registering in that country? You make money in that country, and yet you don't pay any tax in that country. No representation. You are just, well, I know in these days of this uh, technical media things, I don't know whether you call it a figment that is just represented but makes loads of money, sends views through that country, collects views through that country to the rest of the world. It's an anomalous situation. So I am glad that it has finally agreed to register in Nigeria, that it has agreed to deal with the issue of taxation. But if Nigeria thinks it will be able to censor what Twitter does or does not do, that's even something the United States have not, with all its own technical skill and apparatus available, has not been able to do. But this issue is not going to go away. You'll recall that even in Europe and in the United States, there was that issue of taxation because huge multinationals were registering in Ireland where they pay minimum taxes, but were collecting their revenue from the United States, from Europe, and were not paying taxes there. They've been battling with this, with the French. They actually upfront about you cannot operate in our country without, paying taxes, or without at least have a taxation regime that will govern your activities. So we will still hear more of this as time goes on.
Sir, some have challenged the fact that the government lifted the ban based on promises that Twitter was going to make rather than anything substantial actually haven't happened. Um, Given what you've said, sir, do you see that as a wrong thing for the government to have done, or what other approach should they have taken?
Look, if one doesn't in diplomacy or in negotiation, whether diplomacy or economic negotiations, there are times you look at where you've got to, you declare victory, and you move on because you know that is probably the best you are going to get. I mean, if the rest of the world did not join you in confronting Twitter, and if, as I said earlier on, when you first had the question, that Nigerians said they never left Twitter in any case, probably the Nigerian officials felt, they've made their point, they should move on. It's not an issue that I'm familiar with the nitty-gritty of the negotiations. But As I said, I am aware that it's allowed. You run up the flag, you've declared victory. Everybody knows that, you've just been thrown, breadcrumbs while the company has still walked away with the major loaf of bread. And then you move on to other issues.
We should start tweeting about you also, Prof. Now that Twitter is open.
I don't even, I'm not even on Twitter. I don't even know how to operate Twitter account. Um, it's, I don't know how to operate it. So I'm perfectly happy with a telephone and WhatsApp. I will go. Yes.
All right, sir. Thank you for that. Let's move to Russia. Russia has been getting quite a lot of bashing, I would say, from so many quarters about its handling of the situation with Ukraine and where they're going with that. If we pick Kazakhstan, there's still an issue there. If we look at what is happening with NATO, these in themselves are big issues, which I would want you to address individually. But let us start with the issue of Russia and NATO and the demands that Russia is making regarding NATO's incursion into their territory, as they've put it. What is your take on that? Is Russia justified with their view?
Well, even when I listen to, when I deconstruct your language, how you phrased the question, there's no doubt that you've been uh, influenced by CNN or BBC or even Al Jazeera. How many of us, anyway, we are not Russian speakers. I don't even tune into the to Russian English whatever. I mean I try to deconstruct things on my own. You see, the map of Europe was determined at the Yalta Conference, marking the end of the Second World War. Since then, there have been, in some cases, major changes, in some cases, incremental changes following major events. One of it was the collapse of the Soviet Union, um, which I will regard as being equivalent to, well, when I say independence for Asia, Africa, and Caribbean countries from the colonial empires. Now, Russia, there's a whole generation in Russia, and Putin is one of them, who feels that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the worst thing that had happened in Europe to them, because it reduced them from parity with the United States to now just another big player, maybe the biggest player in Europe, but not in the world, as was their aspiration. And so Putin, is now trying to claw back some of these losses. He said they had an understanding, and I'm quoting his words because I watched his press conference at the end of the year, which he does annually. And he said, we were fooled. They gave us an understanding that that NATO will not expand. We were fooled. A lot of the former Soviet members of a lot of members of the Soviet Empire were now in NATO, and he now wants to draw a red line because he now feels that Russia is back strong enough to make that demand. Don't forget there was a period when Russia itself was in a state of turmoil. We don't have enough time on this program to go into the nitty-gritty of that turmoil. But expectedly, and I'm not blaming the Americans for this, the Americans thought they could exploit that turmoil to further reduce the strength of Russia. Now, this was when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. In order to stop that descent into wrath and chaos, a strong man like Putin was brought in. He didn't contest an election the first time. He was brought in and power was handed over to him. And the stakeholders of Russia knew why they handed the power over to him. He was a strong man. Russia and the Soviet Union had always been ruled by strong men. And that's what it has taken to keep Russia together. And so he now decides where to draw the red line. And unfortunately, Ukraine falls smack, or that red line runs through Ukraine, neither to the left nor to the right. And he's now decided to make a stand there. The strong man that he is decided he will use military might to draw that red line there. People have forgotten about Georgia, because also in Georgia, you also had, and what he's done is to play on the presence of Russian-speaking minorities, in those countries. So what we then have now is he is trying to get NATO to concretize that understanding which they had when the Soviet Union broke up, that there will be no further expansion eastward towards Russia. And so it's not a diplomatic game that is being played. It's like chess, but it is in diplomacy. Would he actually, I listened to Ukrainian officials who said, what are you talking about? Will he invade Ukraine? He has already invaded Ukraine. He's taken Crimea from us. He's already taken part of that eastern slice. So what do you mean, will he invade? He's already invaded. It's whether he will continue the invasion or he will freeze it where it is. We don't know. It's a game of diplomatic chess they are playing. But what I want our viewers to know is that there is no right party and there is no wrong party. It depends on where you are based and your perspective. To the Ukrainians, it's an evil move. To the Europeans, it's an evil move. But as Putin once said, if I send troops into Latin America or into Canada. Well, I've moved into American backyard, and I would like expect the Americans to react forcefully. You are the ones wanting to move into our backyard, and therefore expect me as the Russian leader to react the way I am reacting. So I wouldn't pass judgment. And I think this is what is essential for those of us from medium income or high income or low income countries who are not in that area, to refrain from passing judgment, but to try and evaluate the moves that are being made by several parties. Yes, NATO is also right to say you cannot dictate to us what should be our reaction if Ukraine says it wants to join. And you cannot dictate to Ukraine whether it should join or not. In diplomacy, you dictate. You then negotiate what will be the outcome of your dictation and the reaction to that dictation.
So some analysts have said that looking at the way Russia is carrying out its diplomatic activities, recently meeting with the United States, meeting with NATO, and that crucially, there hasn't been a major meeting with the EU. Is that significant?
To some extent, yes, because we are dealing with a military situation. Russian troops are on the border with Ukraine. When there are what Europe perceives as military threat, the appropriate agency it uses for response is NATO. That's why it was set up. NATO was set up as a military organization to react to Soviet military might and to ensure that Soviet military might did not, at that time, go beyond where it was at Yalta. Now, the EU is a post-Yalta development, it's a post-Yalta organization. But I hope you know that actually between EU members and NATO, there is a spillover. It is true that not all members of NATO are in the EU, especially after Britain left. But what pinches EU pinches NATO. And when even the EU decides to react militarily, NATO will be the agency that it will use. So I don't particularly read any meaning into the fact that they haven't sat down with the EU. I think it's an appropriate platform meeting with NATO.
Let's move towards what has happened in Kazakhstan, where Russia had responded to a cry for help from the president there to help with the violence that was going on. Again, it was a move that was criticized by Western leaders. But one point I want to pull out there, sir, is that I think a few episodes back, we talked about what you were trying to do with a South Atlantic Treaty Organization. I think you called it at the time an idea at the time. And the fact that Russia responded to Kazakhstan because of what they called a collective security treaty organization. So effectively, they were helping out their own equivalent of NATO. I hope. What is your take on that? Western leaders have criticized it, but what is your take on that situation in Kazakhstan?
A perfectly normal operation. A government which was a member and is a member of what I will call Commonwealth of East European countries, a legally signed treaty which allows members to come to the aid when asked of any of their members who is in trouble. And that was what was activated. And external forces were not involved. This actually was an internal coup that was being planned by some members of the government itself. And they almost succeeded until the government of the day now activated the agreement that allows forces from fellow members to be used to crush this attempted coup in Kazakhstan. There was nothing. No, the American interests are not involved. Western interests are not involved. Forget the way that, again, the media tended to play it. These were people fighting for prices to be lowered. These were people fighting for human rights. No, none of those things was involved. As we now know, some members of the security elite in Kyrgyzstan wanted a change of government forcefully, and they attempted it, and they almost succeeded until Putin stepped in, because if Russia had said no, that coup would have been successful. But he wasn't going to take a chance, especially given the uncertainty that was going on in Belarus, and the problem he was facing with NATO and so on. That will not be the first time that attempts will be made to activate that treaty. But this will be the first time that Russia will say, yes, let us go in.
Sir, there's a point here on YouTube. Someone is saying that I feel Putin wants the old USSR back. Red line will not be observed by him. I hope Third World War is not staring us in the eyes. Do you see this turning to full-out war?
It's made a good comment. It could turn out to be a third world war by mistake, by misunderstanding. Recall what I said on this program, not once, but several times, that if people dealing with Biden read his body language as someone averse to war at all costs, in other words, that you may have a Chamberlain, a Neville Chamberlain on your hand, and whether it's the Chinese or the Russians, then use violence to try to change the situation, on the understanding that there will be no reaction from Biden except economic sanctions, which has always threatened, and they figure they can live with those sanctions. And then it turned out that actually Biden, at that point, now decides, no, I will stop this by now using American forces. Right now, the reading of American foreign policy by everyone is that Biden is not prepared to use American forces to defend the position in Ukraine, the position in Pakistan has never even featured in it, but maybe if we bring in the Chinese in Taiwan, and then a mistake is made by either Russia or the Chinese in using forces, and such then is the pressure on Biden within the US itself that it then has to resort militarily, then you've rolled yourself into a third world war. But I still believe that at least with Russia, there will be no third world war because of that, what we used to call at that time, MAD syndrome, mutual assurance destruction. America has those missiles it can send over. Russia has those missiles it can send over, and none of them wants to use those missiles to destroy each other. That is where China is also aiming. Sufficient military capability to deter the United States through getting to a plateau where it could threaten the United States if the United States threatens it. That is what has kept the world free of global wars since the Second World War. There have been regional wars, some of them, if not all, instigated by these big powers, but that has kept their own territories safe. Afghanistan is one, the war in Vietnam, if you recall, and several of the wars in the Middle East. We are still keeping our eye on Israel and Iran. That to me is even more dangerous than what is happening in Ukraine. So there are hot spots all over, but I don't think Putin will start a war. I don't think so.
Thank you, sir. I think we'll have time for just about one more question, and I'm going to pick one from the Middle East. And this is one that looks at the announcement from the White House recently that they were going to be giving a further $300 million of aid to Afghanistan. And that's bringing it to almost $1 billion since October that has gone into Afghanistan as aid. Um, do you think that the relationship between the US and the Taliban is starting to now warm up? They're starting to warm up to themselves? Or is this just another gesture from the United States to align itself with international pressure?
Um, Sanctions in these days of the social media, which impact on women and children, cannot be sustained. And the other side knows that. And so every time a camera crew turns up, women and children, starving children, and women are pushed before the camera. And they know that that activates within, that's what makes us human. It activates within us a response that says, forget politics. We've got to feed these women. We've got to feed these children. And very few, except in a situation of war, like what is going on in Ethiopia, very few Western governments can then sustain that regime of sanctions. The regime may be there, and then you start getting exceptions. They went to the UN, and they got the UN to approve that, humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan will not be a violation of the sanctions regime. You may now ask, which we can't answer now. Why not release the money? Why not release Afghanistan money that is seized in several banks instead of keeping that money and then behind starting to make this aid and these donations? But that is the way the game is played. Till today, there is Iranian money seized by the British, goods paid for by Iran, seized by the British. The British will not release the money. They will not release the goods. And so Iran also then plays that game of seizing British, Iranian citizens who manage to get into Iran and keeping them as bargaining chips. The same thing with the United States. Afghanistan money is there. You would have thought, just release this money. But you are keeping the money, but you are using behind. It's probably the same money anyway that is being circulated through the same banking system. And it gives job for diplomats to continue to do when this kind of games are being played. But as people say, as long as children and women are fed, their needs provided for, then we feel we are human. We've behaved like human beings. We've reacted appropriately. But then you can continue then to turn the screw somewhere else.
Unfortunately, sir, I'm going to have to do this to you again tonight, because someone put a comment here on YouTube and said, you said in one of the series that the possibility of Iran attacking Israel is impossible, but today you seem worried, sir.
Yes, because it's not Iran attacking Israel. It's Israel attacking Iran because of the assessment that Iran may be getting close to an irreversible nuclear achievement that Israel has sworn to prevent by all means. So it's the other way around. The one I'm worried about is Israel attacking Iran.
Thank you, sir. And on that note, we will end the program tonight, but we will be back again next week, Thursday, same time. There are so many issues, sir, that have happened over the last few weeks. Mali and ECOWAS, maybe we start with that next week to look at what's going on there, the sanctions and the pushback from the government in Mali. Maybe we start with that next week, and a host of other critical points that I know that you are very keen on talking about. But to our viewers, thank you very much for being here. One quick point: if you do not have the link to Prof's book. Next week I will put it on the chat, and you can download that, but it's available on almost all the mainstream ebook platforms. Just search for thruMYeyes by Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. It will come up on there, so you can download it. But next week I will give a link that you can use to download that book as well. It contains some of the details that Prof has been sharing over the years. And on that note, thank you very much, sir. Look forward to next week as well.
Thank
Bye, sir.
you.
And bye to our
Bye-bye.
viewers.